Hi, I'm a 32-year-old woman and a phlebotomist at a rural hospital. In case you're unfamiliar with phlebotomy, I'm someone who takes blood from patients and prepares it for various kinds of testing. Last year, I encountered an issue with a patient that I've never seen before or since. It's been hard to get off my mind, and I hope writing about it will help. I guess this is also a last-ditch effort in hoping that someone will believe me and help me understand what happened. I've worked at this hospital for 4 years, after spending the previous 4 at a nursing home. I had a bit of a rough upbringing mixed with some drug use, actually part of what got me into this line of work. As I mentioned, my current hospital is deeply rural. There are about 15 miles of woods right out back. I used to spend my smoke breaks out there before all of this. I encountered this patient on the graveyard shift, also known as the overnight. I'm rarely booked on those, as phlebotomy is considered the less urgent sector of the hospital that usually doesn't require late nights, but we were lighter than usual on nurses back then. I was just sitting down when the CNO told me that we needed a draw in A145. I remember feeling annoyed as I made my way towards the back of the hospital. Whoever had done their intake had put this patient at the very end of the hall, with about 20 empty rooms between them and our other bookings that night. It was off the round structure. A 145 was the only room with light under the door. I did my usual knock and announcement before walking in. This part was all captured in the hallway monitor, which I checked the next day. The moment I walked in, I nearly fell backward. A man had pulled the chair from the far corner of the room, near the window, right up to the doorway. He was sitting and facing the entrance, and sprung to his feet the moment I walked in. A boy was lying on the bed behind him, and I could feel a breeze coming from outside. I distinctly remember that the man had on a ball cap that read Louisville in faded letters, and big black sunglasses that contrasted his sallow, droopy skin. He was wearing a shirt that also read Louisville, and he stepped back as I stepped forward, pushing the chair behind him with a scrape. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said quickly, shaking his head back and forth. I remember just laughing in response and telling him it was fine, that I was just used to the chair being in the corner. I turned for the patient chart tucked in the clipboard holder and found it missing. When I turned back, the man was holding it out for me and told me that he'd just finished filling it out. I took it with a nod, scanning the details, then walking over to the boy. It had been filled in with sloppy handwriting. I don't remember all the specifics of how I interacted with the boy, but I know I must have followed my usual procedures before a draw. I smiled down at him, and he stared up at me with watery green eyes. He looked 12, the age his chart read. "Hi there, Lewis," I remember saying, glancing for his name. I asked him how he felt today. The boy looked at the man, then back to me. I heard the scrape of the chair being pulled closer to the bed behind me. "I feel fine, but my father and I want to make sure that I'm all normal, so we came to try this." At that point, the father had his hands on the foot of the bed and was leaning forward, staring from beneath the thick sunglasses. "Of course, Lewis. Well, I'm going to check that out by borrowing a little blood from you if that's all right. It really won't hurt at all." That is roughly what I responded. Suddenly, the man piped up, speaking quickly and loudly so that both Lewis and I turned to him. "It won't hurt at all." The boy nodded in response and seemed to repeat it to himself. I felt myself begin to grow uneasy at the father's mannerisms as I made my way across the room to the medical cabinet. This unease was compounded by a gust from the open window, which chilled me in my scrubs. As I looked out the open window, I could see the tree line not too far away and the branches swaying and clawing against the night sky. I remember that very distinctly. We never kept the windows open, so I moved to close it. As my hand stretched out, I could see the man standing stiffly behind me in the reflection from the glass. "Please leave it open," he cooed. "We get very hot." I was tired, and the man was standing very close to me, so I acquiesced turning back to the medical cabinet and opening it for my supplies. I grabbed what I needed and placed it on the sink counter, washing my hands as I routinely did and slipping on my gloves. I know that all the equipment I took was standard: butterfly needles, vacutainer, collection tubes, gauze, tourniquet, everything you'd expect. There was nothing faulty about the materials. I know that isn't what happened here. I walked up to the left side of the bed and asked Louis to sit up nice and straight. Normally, I prefer using a nice cushiony chair, but those are a bit down the hall, and we're already comfortable in bed, is what I told him, stupidly, instead of taking him to the draw room. I remember things more vividly from here. I placed the collection tubes and needle down on the small table nearby and applied the tourniquet around his mid-bicep. He stared solemnly up at the ceiling as I began to thumb the crook of his arm for the vein. That's when I first knew something was wrong. As I stared down at the boy's arm and felt around with my fingers, I couldn't find the tracings of his veins anywhere. I pressed my thumb harder, squinting as if it would make the blue streaks appear beneath his skin. After nearly a minute, I started to feel confused. I smiled up at the boy, whose eyes held the same watery stare. I decided I'd best try my luck with a puncture. I drew my tools, wiping the crook of his arm with alcohol and aiming the needle in the same place I always did. I was hoping I was just tired. As I dug the needle in, I hoped for the momentary resistance and then gentle pop that accompanied the finding of a vein, but none came. "I'm sorry. I'm going to need to try again," I said, softly. It was what I always remark when I can't find the vein, though I rarely need to. I slid out the needle slowly, pressing a square of gauze against the area before repuncturing. Again, I felt nothing. As this process continued for 6 failed puncture attempts, I began to notice a few things. The first, which I realized as I pushed in the needle for the 3rd time, my teeth gritted, was that the boy did not seem pained at any moment. It was like putting an IV drip in an unconscious person. The second thing I noticed, while I withdrew the needle for the 5th time, was that the gauze I was pressing against the venipuncture sites was clean. I turned the white pad back to me and didn't see a single drop of red. As I looked at his arm, I could see the holes I'd made, but no spotting of blood. The third thing I noticed, after my 6th attempt was unsuccessful, was how close the man had gotten to me while I was trying to draw his son's blood. He was seated on the other side of a rather wide hospital bed, but he was stretching across it, leaning on his hands and crooning his neck, his face only a foot from mine. I almost dropped the needle when I saw him, and it unnerved me even more than Louis's seeming lack of veins. "Something is wrong," the man breathed, and I moved my chair back to create some distance. I put down the needle and stood up, moving towards the foot of the bed. The man paralleled my movements, shooting up from his seat and standing in front of me with a few long strides. The man spoke in a hushed voice from beneath his cap and glasses. "Please tell me what's wrong." He sounded nervous, in a genuine way, but it did nothing to reduce my unease. I whispered back, "I'm sorry, I just haven't seen this before. I'm searching for a vein to draw from, and I just can't find one." The man paused, his hands fidgeting. "What do you mean, exactly?" I let out a confused laugh, mostly out of discomfort. I remember wondering if there was a language barrier. "I mean, I can't find the vein, as in the blue tubes filled with blood in his arm. I've never been unable to locate them like this." "It's not normal," the man muttered, seeming to cock his head to the window behind me. "It's okay. I'll talk to him. He's just nervous." I shook my head back and forth, confused. I don't think he's nervous. In fact, most kids are a little scared of the pain, but Louis doesn't even seem to notice it. I'm worried something is wrong with him, maybe some kind of hypovolemia. His skin feels almost rubbery. The man began to shake his head back and forth, as if he were mimicking my motion. No. Pain in veins. He's all right. I will speak with him for just a second, and then you'll check again." The man was wringing his hands together now. The skin on them, like on his face, looked too wrinkled for his age. The man spun back towards the boy and took 3 long strides until he was at his side, muttering something. I looked over to the door and pictured the long stretch of hallway between myself and the rest of the people in the hospital. I considered who had done intake for the 2 of them, and if the man would even know what I meant if I asked for his insurance. I looked back out the window and wondered again, more intensely than I had the first time, why the glass and the screen were open. The man's voice cut into my thoughts. "Okay, he is ready." The man was standing next to my chair, one hand tightly gripping the boy's shoulder. A thought came to me then, that if I were to yank that hat and sunglasses off his face, the man would fall apart like that girl with the ribbon on her neck. The idea scared me. As I moved towards my chair, the man slinked behind it, holding the back of the seat. Looking at the both of them was starting to make me sick. One time I saw a patient brought in who'd clipped his knee against a rock while cliff diving, twisting his lower leg so badly his foot was facing backward. The wrongness of looking at that was what I felt while looking at the father and his son. I sat in the chair and just focused on the boy, hearing the man breathing heavily behind me. I drew a fresh needle for Louis and reached for him before my eyes widened. There, running up and down his arm, were thick blue veins. I gripped his elbow and could feel them pumping beneath the skin. They were undoubtedly there. I could hear the man's breath quickening, almost with excitement. I didn't know what to say. I wiped the area in the crook of the boy's arm and prepared the needle. Louis's skin felt moist, even through my gloves. I saw his face and neck too, had droplets of perspiration. His skin was almost sticky now. "I'm scared." Louis's voice came out like the croak of a frog. His big, watery eyes met mine. Some of his hair was clinging to his forehead from the sweat. I stopped moving the needle towards his arm and leaned forward. "Louis, are you okay? Is something going on?" is what I responded. I could feel the man leaning over me. The boy nodded yes. "I'm scared of the pain from the needle. It won't hurt any more than last time, Louis. It's okay." I think that's how I reassured him, but I myself was confused. After that, Louis turned to look back towards the ceiling, his face going back to the stern grimace it had the entire time. I'd never seen such an inhuman reaction before. I didn't know what to do but proceed with drawing the blood. I aimed the needle right towards the bright, obvious veins and dug it into his arm. I felt the pop of the vein almost instantly. I closed my eyes for a moment as the blood flowed from the needle into the first vial on the small table. I vividly imagined 20 minutes from now, when I was back down the hall, recanting what an odd experience my last draw was, and someone would commiserate with me that the graveyard shifts were always a mental strain. That's where I wanted to be. I opened my eyes and let out a gasp that barely avoided being a scream. What I saw was that the blood sliding from the needle, up the tubes, filling the first vial was a deep blue, the same color as the boy's veins. It looked like thick blue paint. I likely would have fallen backward out of my seat if it didn't mean I'd fall into the man behind me, and the idea of touching him was worse than anything. "What's wrong now?" The man's was leaning down behind me, not far from my ear. His voice sounded harsher now than when he last asked this. "Nothing," I remember stuttering out. I stopped the draw as it filled the first vial, sliding the needle out and wrapping gauze around the puncture point that began to stain blue. I knew I needed to get out of there. I picked up the vial and could hear the man moving behind me. The boy held his same zombie-like stare at the ceiling. As I stood up, the man was in front of me, between my path to the door. One of his hands was extended out to me. He was grinning, and I looked away from his teeth. I've replayed this interaction a lot of times in my head. "Please," I said then. I don't know exactly why. "Everything's normal with the boy now." "Yes," I sputtered out. I felt like I could hear movement from outside the window, excited movement. "Please," the man replied, grinning wider. I held out to Vile, placing it into his palm from which the skin seemed to sag, and he moved out of my way. I almost ran towards the door, pulling it open as I felt tears begin to well in my eyes, and then slamming it behind me. My leaving, as well, was captured on the camera. And that was that. I told the CNO, and whoever was there at the time, nearly hysterical, that there was something horribly wrong in the room at the end of the hall, but it was empty once they'd reached it. I don't know exactly why any of it happened. I know people in here are probably more willing than most circles of the internet to believe this kind of crazy stuff. If anyone has any ideas, I'm open to hearing them. I haven't come up with any medical or logical prognosis. The last thing I should say is that since then, if I'm ever unfortunate enough to get the graveyard shift, I'm very careful. I make sure to lock all the windows before it gets dark, because I sometimes hear the ones in the empty rooms rattling from the outside. I've always been afraid of being attacked on the street at night. Despite years of working in a bar and coming home late around midnight, this fear had never left me. The pay was lousy, and the boss forbade employees to park their cars in the parking lot reserved for customers. So every night, I had to walk alone for several minutes to my car parked a little further away. One day, as I was talking to one of my friends, she told me about this application. "Don't you know this app? It's called Are You Being Followed?" or AYBF for short. Basically, the app detects the waves of nearby cell phones, and if the algorithm notices that a signal is following you, the app sends you a notification, she explained. Some say it also detects ghosts and supernatural creatures that give off particular waves. But I think that's bullshit to attract views on TikTok, she added. I couldn't quite figure out how it worked, but she assured me that the algorithm was never wrong, and that it had already allowed her once to be alerted early enough to be safe from a strange guy one night. I downloaded it, figuring it couldn't hurt. One evening, as I was walking down the street clutching my coat, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. It was the app that had sent me a notification, and on the screen simply appeared the message, "You are being followed." I slowed down and looked around. The street was deserted, only the wind sounding in my ears. Perplexed, I continued walking, the sound of my solitary footsteps echoing around me. A minute later, I received another notification. "You are being followed." With no one behind me, I wondered if it was a bug or if this app was literally a scam. "Boo!" I jumped and shouted. And right in front of me was my colleague Ian, wallowing in laughter. Sorry, I couldn't help it. Here, you forgot your tips," and he handed me a few bills. "Next time you do that, I'll empty my pepper spray in your face." Safe in my car, I finally managed to laugh it off and figured that at least I had proof that the app worked. The app never triggered again after that. Until tonight. I just finished a long evening and was exhausted. All I wanted to do was go home and go to bed. As I was walking alone in the cold night, with just enough strength to look at the tips of my feet without falling asleep while walking, my cell phone vibrated, and I picked it up, thinking someone had sent me a text message. "You are being followed." The appearance of the message caught me off guard and woke me up all at once. I looked around. There was nothing and no one around at this late hour, and the temperature was negative. I thought back to the only time it had gone off and Ian's joke. He knew perfectly well by now that I didn't find it funny, and I had made it clear that I hoped he wouldn't do it again, or he would get his ass kicked. I stood there looking back, looking for someone who obviously didn't exist. Still suspicious, I resumed my walk, keeping my phone in my hand. After a minute, it vibrated again. You are being followed. I looked around again, but there was nothing. I was starting to panic. I was alone, in the middle of the night, and I was beginning to think something was wrong. A paper cup was pushed by the wind, and the noise startled me. Is anyone there? I felt compelled to say aloud. Obviously, no one answered. If there's anyone, I'm warning you, I'm armed, I lied, trying to be as convincing as possible. When nothing happened, I started to turn around to resume my walk, and at the last moment, out of the corner of my eye, even as I turned my head, I swore I saw something moving in the shadows at the corner of an alley. It took me a while to process what I'd seen. At first, I thought it had been a cat. No, cats don't have white eyes. I walked quickly. You are being followed. Behind me, there was absolute silence. You are being followed. Was it the sound of bare feet on the sidewalk I just heard? You are being followed. I clutched my pepper spray can as I took the last few steps to my car while looking around like a madwoman attacked by imaginary birds. I closed the car door and locked the doors. Finally, I managed to exhale the air I'd been holding in my lungs. I didn't wait any longer, not wanting to linger here, and started the engine. Once home, I took a shower and got ready for bed. It had been a strange night. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered why the application had triggered so many times. Wasn't it possible that there had been a malfunction, and I just imagined what I thought I was hearing and seeing because of the stress? After a while, I came to the conclusion that the app was bugged and that my overactive imagination combined with my natural fear of being attacked had done the rest. I put my mobile in my pocket and made several trips to the kitchen to throw away the remains of my dinner. My cell phone vibrated. You are being followed. My breathing stopped. I stood there for several seconds, staring at my screen. I raised my head slowly and looked around. I inspected every nook and cranny accessible to my view without making a move. The light in my bedroom was still off. Apart from that, I couldn't see any place where an intruder might be. I made my way discreetly towards my bedroom. Stop stressing. You said it yourself. This app doesn't work. I continued walking slowly and put my hand on the light switch just to the left of the door. I pressed it. I took a few steps inside, but without a doubt, no intruder, ghost, or monster had entered my room. As I returned to the living room, reassured, my gaze was drawn to the window and the night outside. And there I saw the pale face of a creature, glued to the glass, staring back at me with the two whitest eyes I'd ever seen in my life. After a second spent trying to understand what I was seeing, I screamed in fear. The police immediately dispatched a patrol car after my panicked call. The two officers inspected the area around the house without finding anyone who resembled the vague description I'd given them, even though they seemed worried. I had obviously avoided mentioning the fact that what I had seen had white eyes and skin and a bald head. After a while, they had to leave and told me to call back if I ever saw someone at my window again. I closed all my shutters and spent the night awake, a knife resting on the living room table. When day broke, I finally got the courage to leave my house. I looked around it and saw something the police hadn't seen or hadn't wanted to tell me. Just below the window where I'd seen this thing, there were dozens and dozens of bare footprints going from left to right towards all the other windows. I'm aware that this is unconventional. Believe me, I've tried conventional. It didn't end well for anyone. I require a certain open-mindedness that I'm hoping I might find here. But more importantly, I need my future husband to know the rules. Meet-cutes are well and good on the screen, but they don't guarantee a partner's ability to follow basic instructions. That was my mistake the first time. So, begging your pardon for my bluntness, I'm going to be clear about my requirements. Please read carefully. If you can't meet them, there's no point in going any further. Must want children. At least one child anyway. I'm open to the idea of more, but one is an absolute must. Must be in it for the long haul. Until our child turns 18, to be precise. I understand that level of commitment is a daunting prospect, particularly when we have not yet met. After our child is born, you are welcome to ignore me, if you please, or take your pleasure elsewhere, though I will warn you that it might be difficult to come by. But you will live under my roof until our child is an adult. Homebody preferred. It will make the next 2 decades easier on you. Must have impeccable manners. I will provide a manual outlining the required etiquette, but you must at least have a grasp of basic courtesy to begin with. If you let your tongue run away with you, or don't bother to wish your neighbors a good morning when you pass them in the street, stop reading. This is not the opportunity for you. Seriously, this is the part where I should talk about myself, but let's face it, this is hardly a romantic proposal. I require commitment up front, and there's no guarantee that once we do meet, we'll really even like each other. If we do, fantastic. It'll help the years fly by. If we don't, you'll still have the main prize, years of rent-free, expenses-free living at the Old Oak Hotel. A sanctuary has stood in this spot, in one form or another, since before the ley lines. During its tenure, it has been flooded, put to the flame, and pounded into dust. Time and again, it has been reimagined and rebuilt. Most of the current building dates back to Victoria's reign, though the oldest parts were constructed in the 13th century. At the very bottom of the garden, cut into the surrounding hills, there is a cave bearing handprints of red ochre. There has always been an Edwards at the hotel, though of course we haven't always gone by that name. You would think a family so tied to one place would do a better job of keeping records, but no one is certain of our origins. Perhaps it was a cosmic bargain, or perhaps mere luck. Whether good or bad, I have never been able to decide. Either way, our presence is required. Throughout our spotty past, there's a story here and there of an Edwards deserting their post, and it always coincides with a particularly brutal period of history. I inherited the position 5 years ago. At midnight on my 18th birthday, my parents took their already packed suitcases and left. I don't blame them for their abandonment. I intend to one day do the same thing to my, or hopefully, our child. They send me postcards and photos from time to time, always smiling on sunny beaches. Money isn't a concern for them. That's part of whatever mysterious deal our ancestors made. When a caretaker leaves in good standing, they will never want for anything again. They could travel the world for the rest of their lives, always sleeping in the softest sheets and dining in the finest restaurants, and never find their pockets empty. Keep this point in mind, for if you can meet my requirements, you will share my good fortune. And what must we do in return? I can all but hear you scream the question. Why, very little. The presence of an Edwards ensures that the guests can't stray from the hotel grounds. Most of our guests are live-in residents, though we do get the occasional walk-in. Where they come from, I don't know, for we are not visible to most people who stumble upon our lonely corner of the world. I've come to believe the hotel chooses to reveal itself when it's lacking entertainment, or to fill a need. Jimmy, my first husband, was one such guest. For the most part, the guests are harmless. They'll give you a little fright from time to time, popping out from a wall or turning your bathwater into blood. But I find it hard to hold it against them. I found 23 years here dreary. I can't imagine how bored I would be after 500. There are a few exceptions you should be aware of. Erik, our resident serial murderer. He claims to have been Jack the Ripper while he still drew breath, but I think he's just a blowhard. He knows better than to harm an Edwards, but I'm afraid spouses are fair game. Years ago, my grandmother managed to confine him to the 4th floor, so you will be perfectly safe from him as long as you never set foot there. Occasionally, the lift will stop on that floor, even though you haven't pressed the button for it. Do not get out. even if the lift appears to be on fire or starts filling with murky water. Wait for the doors to close again, then go to another floor. It should only take a few hours. The thing in the cellar, I don't know what it is. No one ever has. We only know it eats rats and must be fed once a day. If I'm ever ill or incapacitated, this task will fall to you. Harvest the rats from the traps in the garden, then stand at the cellar door and throw them down the stairs. Do not walk down the stairs, and do not forget to feed it. You don't want to be the first person to see its face. Mrs. Jones. Old-fashioned and a stickler for manners. She's the reason I'm advertising for a husband rather than a boyfriend. She won't abide a couple living in sin under the same roof as her. Really, though, she's a sweet old thing, full of stories about the war and always ready to help if I get stuck on a recipe. I don't blame her for what happened with Jimmy at all. I'd warned him enough times. Guests aside, there are other rules you will need to follow to ensure a safe, satisfactory stay at the Old Oak Hotel. They are listed in a book that has been repenned many times over the centuries. If you choose to accept this opportunity, I will insist that you read it until you can recite the pages word for word. However, there are some rules so critical for your survival that I feel compelled to list them here. With the exception of the 4th floor, you're welcome to roam the hotel and its grounds as you please. But you must never set foot outside of our land, not until our child is old enough to fulfill their duties. If I were to do so, it would unleash pandemonium, plague, peril, perhaps another world war. I'm afraid you would be less crucial to the fate of the world, but it would certainly be a personal disaster. Never look in the mirrors in room 33. I've touched this point already, but it bears repeating. Never be rude to Mrs. Jones. Failure to observe that last rule is what got Jimmy. She doted on him. I think he reminded her of her long-dead son, for she pampered him as if he were one of her own. Each morning, she had breakfast ready for him before I had so much as opened my eyes, and she developed a habit of trailing along after him, complimenting his skill as he oiled rusted hinges or set a crooked picture straight. At first, Jimmy basked in the attention, but by the end of his 2nd month, he was growing bored of Mrs. Jones, me, and the hotel itself. We pride ourselves on our facilities. If you need more activity than a turn around the garden, we have a lovely indoor pool. It freezes over every now and then, but most of the time it's perfectly usable. Our library is unmatched. Although the room is cramped, it has every book imaginable. You only need to think of a particular title, and it will appear on one of the shelves. And now that I've dragged us kicking and screaming into the 21st century, we have a wide array of streaming services. It wasn't enough for Jimmy. He wanted to go out, eat in a restaurant, watch a film in the cinema, see any faces other than the ones he was surrounded by every day. He began having a drink each evening. One drink turned into several, and after a few weeks, the bar became his permanent residence between dusk and midnight. He wasn't the only one getting bored. I had been thrilled when he first arrived, ecstatic when he agreed to stay. How marvelous to feel real flesh beneath my fingers after 5 years of only the dead for company. What a relief to have some assistance in the many tasks required to keep the hotel running as it should. The more he drank, the less inclined he was to help, or even spend time in my company. He no longer visited my bed, choosing a room for himself on the opposite end of the floor. When our paths did cross, at best he would ignore me. At worst, he would nitpick or outright rail against me, blaming me for his captivity. Still, I made an effort to be present whenever he frequented the bar. As lovely as Mrs. Jones can be, she does have a tendency to nag. Before and after her death, she was close to teetotal, only consenting to take a single sherry at Christmas, and drinking outside of special occasions is something of a bugbear of hers. "Think of your health, dear," she would tell Jimmy brusquely. "You'll miss it when it's gone." Or, "How about we switch to a nice apple juice now?" You've had quite enough to drink for one night." Most of the time, Jimmy managed to pull himself together enough to flash a charming smile and distract her with a compliment about her latest meal. But after one drink too many, I'd noticed him gritting his teeth and just barely managing to hold his tongue. It was better if I was present. Playing the doting wife, I insisted on pouring his drinks, watering them down out of his sight. When Mrs. Jones's nagging bordered on relentless, I could always distract her with a game of gin rummy. On his final day, I was running behind. The ghoul on the second floor, usually the least demanding of our guests, had come down with some dreadful illness, or else decided he wanted to inconvenience me. Either way, I had woken that morning to the foulest stench I had ever experienced. I followed it to his room and found every surface covered in putrid green blank gunge, its consistency somewhere between mucus and vomit. All day I scrubbed, taking only brief breaks to step outside before I fainted. By the time the room was restored to a passable state, and I had filled several bin bags to bursting with filthy rags, it was already deep into the night. Mindful of the time, I paused only long enough to wash the streaks of muck from my arms and face before racing to the bar. I arrived just in time to hear Jimmy's last words. After he spat them at Mrs. Jones, she only stared for a small eternity, her mouth frozen in the motherly smile she wore whenever she scolded him. Then, like melted wax, her face began to shift. I shouted at Jimmy to run, but he didn't need to be told. Before the words left my mouth, he leapt from his bar stool and streaked through the door. Mrs. Jones followed him seconds later. Her lips were already peeling back to reveal rows upon rows of long, wickedly sharp fangs, while claws sprouted from beneath her lace-edged cuffs. I sprinted after them, but Jimmy was fueled by fear, and Mrs. Jones by whatever force propels the Mrs. Joneses of the world. I followed the screeching to the lobby. Breathless, I arrived to see he had arrived within mere feet of the entrance before Mrs. Jones grabbed him. Claws wrapped around his throat, she lifted him into the air. As I watched, her jaw unhinged, the lower part dropping so that it was nearly level with her chest. That sight drove all the sense out of my head. Forgetting every rule my parents had ever drilled into me, I lunged at her. She batted me away as though I weighed no more than a fly. I crashed into the reception desk, the breath bursting from my lungs in a great whoosh. I was certain that I would die, for no amount of effort seemed to force air back into my aching chest. At last, as my vision began to dim, I managed to take a small gulp, then another, and another, until I was able to draw myself together enough to regain my feet. By that time, Mrs. Jones had nearly finished her dinner. Jimmy's chest was splayed open, muscle and shattered ribs protruding every which way from his flesh, and she was devouring the last few bites of his heart. His head was angled towards me. The light had winked out from his eyes, but they still held his final terror, and an accusation which, I was quite certain, was directed at me. I would like to say I felt only horror, but I couldn't help my sudden jolt of irritation. How many times had I told him to mind his manners? Mrs. Jones gulped, the sound thick and wet in her gullet, and dropped what remained of Jimmy to the floor. Then she turned to me. "Here's another rule for you, one which I hope you never have cause to use. Never interfere with a kill. The Mrs. Jones who used to kiss my grazed knees, who argued with my mother for the right to read me bedtime stories, was no longer at the wheel. No amount of pleading or reasoning would move her. I could only run. Spinning around, I vaulted over the reception desk and raced for the office behind it. If Jimmy had not been out of his mind with fear and booze, he might have remembered the rules and survived. It was one of several staff-only rooms throughout the hotel, warded to keep out unwanted guests. Just 10 steps from desk to door, yet it was the longest journey of my life. My hard-won breath burned my throat. My heart pounded in my ears, deafening me to all other sounds than Mrs. Jones's heavy pounding footsteps. Grasping the handle, her hot copper-tanged breath was on my neck. fire exploded in my flesh as she raked her claws down my back. A step further away, and I wouldn't have made it. The pain would have been too great. But I managed to throw myself into the office and slam the door before crumpling to the ground. Before I passed out, I heard her grunting and shrieking outside, furious that she couldn't get in. 3 days I spent in the office, emerging only to feed the thing in the cellar before scurrying back to my hiding place. Whenever I left, I tried not to look at the mangled heap that used to be Jimmy. There was no avoiding the smell, though. With no small difficulty and the help of a first aid kit, I managed to treat and bandage the wounds on my back. They bled sluggishly all throughout the first day, but thankfully didn't fester. On the morning of the 4th day, there was a tentative knock on the door, followed by the sound of rapidly retreating footsteps. I waited until they had disappeared down the corridor before cracking the door open. On the floor was a freshly baked Victoria sponge and a beautifully written note of apology. It took every ounce of courage I possessed, but that evening I forced myself to go to the dining room. Mrs. Jones was waiting for me, her eyes red-rimmed, a steaming cottage pie on the table. I tried not to flinch as she took my hand, reiterating the apology she had already delivered in writing. The next morning, she helped me clean Jimmy up. We treated each other cautiously for a while, but eventually we got back to playing gin rummy again. When the scars on my back twinge, as they sometimes do, she helps me rub a soothing ointment into them. Even though I've told her it's not necessary, she apologizes every time. So, you've heard my story and you have my proposal. If you think you could be the man for me, I invite you to visit. You will need to drink a cup of ram's blood, a pinch of nutmeg makes it a little more tolerable, and light a black candle before bedtime. When you next wake, you will find yourself at our gates. As travel arrangements go, it's hardly the Orient Express, but it beats the airfare. If you have read this without flinching, if you can stomach the journey to get here, if you walk up to our door and find the nerve to open it, I have one more instruction for you. Just as you enter, look to your right. You will see a deep brown stain on the lobby carpet. I've scrubbed and scrubbed, but it just won't come out. Perhaps that's for the best. It's a good reminder of what will happen to you should you call Mrs. Jones a nosy old bat. And when you run into Jimmy, as you will, for he still likes hanging around the bar in the evening, his silvery wounds glistening as though they had just been inflicted. Don't let him convince you he was some sort of victim. He knew the rules,